I'm going to introduce our speaker today. Today we have Frank Demmler. He has served as adjunct teaching professor of entrepreneurship at the Donald H. Jones Center for Entrepreneurship of the Tepper School of Business at CMU since 1987. Until 2018, he served as Innovation Works Vice President of Entrepreneurial Services, leading the organization's seed investments of over 75 million in over 300 companies during his tenure. He was also a managing director of the Riverfront Venture Fund, a $23.7 million fund that invests in the Pittsburgh region. Mr. Demmler has more than 35 years of experience advising both entrepreneurs and angel investors. He has a significant experience having served as president and CEO of the Future Fund, general partner of the Pittsburgh Seed Funds, co-founder and investment advisor of the Western Pennsylvania Adventure Capital Fund, vice president of venture development for the Enterprise Corporation of Pittsburgh. And Frank holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Mechanical Engineering from Princeton University, a master's degree in General Management from the University of California at Los Angeles Graduate School of Management, and pursued postgraduate studies in marketing at the Harvard Business School. And Frank, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Okay, thank you, Allison. Glad to see such a significant turnout under these circumstances. It's the first time I've given this presentation in an online mode. So, and this is also the first time I'm using my AirPod Pros as my microphone instead of my laptop, because I've been told that it's better sound. So I hope that proves to be the case. I'm going to jump into the presentation, like Allison said. Feel free to jump in, ask questions, and we'll go from there, okay? So, oops. Get you out there. And away we go. Okay, so I hope you all can see my slide. It's a big white slide with black letters. So we're going to talk about equity compensation, and the overall presentation has several more slides than what I'm going to share with you today. Those slides are hidden in PowerPoint. So I encourage you to look at the hidden slides as well. You can do that by scrolling down the left column in PowerPoint, or you can look at it in that the slide matrix view, and you can see what's there and what's uncovered or not. So I just encourage you to take a look at those. It is good information that complements what I'm going to talk about. We won't dwell on this, obviously, because Allison just basically reviewed all of this. But you know, the bottom line, I think, is that I've been engaged in the Pittsburgh technology-based entrepreneurial sector since 1984. As such, I've been involved with thousands of companies. I've been directly involved in investing in over 400 companies. Total dollar value of deals that I participated in probably exceeds several $billion ultimately. And so consider me a resource to you. Feel free to contact me by email if you have a question, or if you think I could help you in some way. So we're going to talk about equity compensation. And first question, obviously, is why do you care? Well, as you start your company, one of the very first decisions you have to make after your decision to get started is that you have to form an entity, a business, uh, that will then be the focus of your activity. And when you create a company, you have to establish uh, ownership of the company at that moment in time. And so in the technology world of starting things, it's most likely that you'll get started as a C Corp. And as such, you will need to establish shares in that corporation, and then you will have to designate certain person or people who will own shares in the company, and that's called the founder's pie. At time equals zero, who is in the company and how many shares do they deserve based upon that. Secondly, stock options are really the way that early stage companies try to entice management or key individuals to join the company. Everyone knows that a startup has inherent risk, and as such, the kind of people that you want to join you are people that probably aren't looking to join an early stage, high risk venture because they've either got a great job and or they're already being recruited for positions at companies that are better established and have a surer future. And so stock options are typically the incentive that is used by early stage companies to attract those people to come on board. On the flip side, if you are thinking of joining an early stage company, you will be looking for stock options as justification for joining the company in terms of compensation or ultimate remuneration. So you really need to understand stock options and how they fit the overall context. And then also stock options are used in incentive plans so that every year it's likely that you'll go through a review or you reviewing members of your team who report to you. And as you talk about the next year, normally you'll talk about what the compensation base is. You'll talk about whether there is a cash incentive bonus, and you'll also talk most likely about stock options being added to your pool so that you can continue to benefit from your contributions. So bottom line is these are really a core element of an early stage business and something that any first-time entrepreneur needs to really understand what they are, how they're used, and how they should use them. So, founder's pie. I briefly described it. And so, you know, at time equals zero, who owns what? There's a pie. The pie adds up to 100%. And sometimes the pie will get divided along these lines. In essence, what I'm saying here is sometimes there is a core founder, a core leader, the person who really is driving the bus, and then several people that are joining that entrepreneurial effort. So there might be a case where one person gets a majority of the stock or half the stock, and the other participants at the founding will get lesser amounts. It's also possible that as you look at the founders, and again, I'm using 4 people as an example, but where sort of the pecking order of the participants is fairly obvious, and therefore there's sort of a step function of ownership going through the participants. But this is the standard. I would say, I don't know, 50 or 60% of startups, maybe even more, start with dividing the pie among the founders evenly. So the conventional wisdom, you got X number of founders, you divide that into 100, and that's how you determine a fair percentage. And that's sort of conventional wisdom. And my caution to you is that is not the way you should establish the distribution of the founder's pie. And I want to caution you that if you were to do it that way, that could be fatal. Your company may not be able to raise money under those circumstances, a number of different things. So let's talk about that. If you got 2 founders, you've got one that joins the company full-time, and the other one is maintaining his or her job and helping out nights and weekends. Would a 50-50 split make sense there? Is that fair? I think not. Company's doing well. You go down the road, and one of the founders believes that the company has the opportunity to change the world. That founder wants to reinvest any profits or surplus funds back into the company. And the other founder says, gee, I'm happy making $400,000 a year or whatever the number is, and I don't want to put that at risk, and I want to maintain that level of compensation moving forward. Well, how do you resolve that if each owner is 50%? Or what happens if the company needs additional funding? You can't get it from the outside world. Therefore, it has to come out of the pockets of the founders. One invests, the other one doesn't. So those are some of the issues that come up. And when you look at those issues with 3 or more founders, the complexity of addressing each of those problems becomes even more severe. And I think you can sort of impute from what I'm saying that the idea of just dividing the pie equally among the founders isn't the right way to go about things. So obviously the question is, what should you do? Well, I'm going to offer you some insights. You got to think about when you slice up the founder's pie, the stock that is being distributed to the founders reflects who's contributed what to date and what is the contribution of that person into the future. And do those all align the motivations and the direction of the various parties? So this is not a etched in stone 5 factors, but it's 5 factors that work. So what are the elements of value in a startup? Well, the idea is important. The idea is just a flash of inspiration of a market opportunity, or the idea could be patented technology or soon to be patented technology that could be the underlying basis of a commercial enterprise. There has to be a concept of what is the business that can be created from the idea, You've got people with regard to what their skills are, their experience. Are they, how active are they in a particular sector? Do they have contacts and access to uh, uh, industry participants in a way that will benefit the company? Recruiting people to join the company, understanding the dynamics of how business operates within a particular industry. So those are all very important elements. There is a question of risk. As I pointed out earlier, what if among the founders, one out of four founders, one commits to the company, the other three don't? I think a strong case can be made that the person who jumps into the company full time is making a real commitment and is taking on significant risk and should be properly rewarded or incented for that. And then who's got responsibility? How important are those things? So again, at an early stage business, developing a business model, raising money, creating identity for a company, establishing its reputation within the marketplace. Who is doing the important things that need to be done for the company if it is to ultimately succeed? So if you take those 5 ideas, and let's take the case, we've got a university Spinout. Number 1 is a tenured professor who is the inventor of a particular technology. Founder 2 is the business guy, somebody who understands the business issues, can conceive of a business that can deploy the technology in a way that delivers customer value and in a way that provides protection from competitors or others. Founder 3, postdoc student. That's the person who actually knows how to make the technology work. That's the person who can produce the solution, the chemical composition, the processing steps, the how do you take the idea and produce a product that then can be utilized for commercialization purposes. And there's a lab tech who happened to be there at the time. And so we've got 4 founders. And what do? Well, my suggestion is you take a look at the components of the business on the left column. The first thing you do is how important are each of those to this particular business? And so for this case, I'm saying the idea, it's technology, it's proprietary, there are patents. So all of that is very important. The business model is less important because it's likely that you're going to be in an industry that has ways of doing business. And secondly, it's going to be a period of time from when the business launches to when it'll actually begin commercial operations. And so at the very beginning, that business model is of less importance. Domain expertise obviously has value. Commitment is a particular consideration, and responsibility. So those numbers are not etched in stone either. That's what the purpose of this exercise is among the founders to come up with what are the relative rankings of each of those components. Then we take a look at each of the founders. And on a scale of 1 to 10, how do they play into each of those factors? So you see founder 1 gets a lot of value from the idea because he's the patent holder, she's the patent holder, she's the industry luminary around the world. The domain expertise is access to potential customers with whom that founder has interacted in the past. Founder two, the business person, will have some contribution to the translation of the technology into a business, so that's important. That person is really going to be the one responsible for conceiving of the business model. Domain expertise may not be strong, but joining the company full time and being responsible for fundraising and leading the company is a very significant set of responsibilities. Founder three, on the other hand, the tech, not the tech, the postdoc student, that person knows the idea because she's been working with it, and she has industry expertise and contacts and all of that. And then you got founder four, the lab tech, who has some skills in the lab in terms of the deployment of the technology, but really doesn't come into play anywhere else. To take all that together, you end up with scores where you take the weight and the value of each cell, multiply them through, you come up with those numbers. Those numbers then translate into this situation. And so what we end up with here is across all the founders, we're talking about a total of 321 points. We're talking about points that each of the founders have been weighted values. And when everything is pulled together, this is the outcome. This is for guidance. Those are not the deterministic values of what your founder's pie will look like. It will be important in terms of, do the relative positions of the participants seem to be reasonable? Does the business guy, by jumping in and taking responsibility for fundraising and all, does that jive? Does that make sense that perhaps would be the person with the greatest? One of the issues in terms of founder one, who is the university professor who founded the technology, if this is the first time that individual has participated in creating a company, it is not unusual for that person to think that he or she deserves 60% of the company because it's their technology, and their technology makes the company, and absent that technology, there is no company. And so if that were to be that the thought process that the founder one had gone through, founder one is not going to like this distribution of ownership, either on a relative or an absolute basis. So those are the type of issues that this process can surface and be discussed at this point in time, rather than waiting until later. So just going back here, the founder's pie should reflect the contributions to date and the contributions in the future, and equal distribution is not likely. So when you're thinking about overall equity compensation, when the company achieves a Allison, I think there's some chats coming in or whatever. Can you take a look at them and surface any that we ought to address as I'm going through here?
Yeah, I have one that says finance would be part of a business model, right? Question mark.
Yeah, yeah, it would be, and it would be one of the primary factors that would need to be addressed in the responsibility area, because somebody has to raise money, and absent that money, the company isn't going to get too far. Uh, so you're starting a company, and one of the things is if you're going to require an outside investment, and most technology-based startups will, you have to recognize that those investors will want to get a return on that investment within a reasonable time frame. It's often said that the investors want to get their money back in 3 to 5 years. And the way they get their money back is by the company going through an exit. And the exit is done in two typical ways. One, the company is acquired, and therefore the acquisition price can be distributed back to the ownership, including the investors, and they're able to turn their equity investment into cash, which they then can distribute out to their investors. Or the company goes through a public offering. And so those are the two ways that it happens. And while there are many, many, many exceptions to this sort of rule of thumb, it's not bad to think about it in the context that when the day is done, founders and company participants, they're going to own 1/5 to 1/3 of the company at that time. And so you need to think about, okay, if that's the case, and if the company were to achieve an exit value of some value, how does that ripple through to the individual people? Because stock options are as important as they are, when a new round of investment comes in and stock is acquired by that investor, that means that the equity percentages that are held by that are in the stock option pool and available to attract future participants in the company are going to be reduced from, let's say we start at 20%. That 20% is going to be 12% on a post-financing basis once the money is in. And in order to be safe in terms of having a pool that's sufficient to go ahead and attract future people to the company, a new stock option pool will be created to bring that 12% back up to, say, 20%. And so those are created over time, and they have an impact on the overall valuation dynamics of the company. Okay, so I've used the phrase stock options a lot. I would expect that most of you have heard the phrase, but what is it? A stock option is not stock. A stock option is the right to buy a share of stock sometime in the future at a price that's determined at the time of the grant, and that's called the exercise price. And the stock option will, in all likelihood, have a number, will have an expiration date. And under different circumstances, it's probably going to be 2 years or 5 years, It's unlikely for the type of company that I've described that it'll be 10 years, but that is a possibility. So why do you care? Well, if you have 50,000 options with a $1 exercise price, and the company is acquired 5 years in the future at $10 a share, then that individual can buy 50,000 shares at $1 a share. 50K goes out, immediately sell them at $10 a share, and $500,000 then is received by that individual, representing a gain of $450,000. So those are the type of calculations that potential employees will want to go through or need to go through, or you want to go through in terms of enticing them to come on board, is what does the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow look like if we are able to accomplish those things that we're trying to accomplish? And so then the question is, how many options is enough? Well, a typical answer is it depends. And the reality is the number of options that you get, the value of them is a function of how many fully diluted shares are there with the company. So fully diluted shares, they include the shares that are outstanding, which at any moment in time will be those shares associated with the founder's pie. They're going to be associated with the stock option pool because those are set up to be shares, if not today, sometime in the future. And so you have to give consideration to all of that. And that's what fully diluted means. And then if you have 5,000 options, you can see the percent ownership is very much a function of how many fully diluted shares are outstanding. So you have to know what the fully diluted share base is of the company in order to evaluate the options. And you have to ask that question if you're thinking of joining a company. You need to be prepared to answer that question if you're trying to recruit somebody to join the company. The number of options only has value in the context of the total fully diluted stock base of the company. Okay, so we've talked about stock options, but guess what? Those stock options vest over time. And so, now you see it, now you don't. Well, typically there's a vesting schedule. So when you're granted those stock options, you don't own them immediately. You will earn those stock options over time, and that's called vesting. In this day and age, a typical vesting schedule is intended to provide ongoing incentive to the company to remain with the company, because if they don't own all the options yet, if they were to leave, they are sacrificing the options that are remaining that the employee could gain. So the typical vesting schedule is going to be 4 years. 25% of the shares cliff vest on the first anniversary. That means for the first 364 days of the year, that individual does not own any of the options that have been granted. And then on the first anniversary, bingo, 25% of those shares are vested and owned by the company. As you might assume or see about this, what that also means is an employee who's there for stock options basically is on probation for the first year. So that if it doesn't work out and you find that you have to separate an individual from the company, if you do so in the first year, that person will not have any stock options owned and will not impact the company negatively by leaving. And after the cliff vest, then you get 1/36 of the balance over the next 3 years. And that's a total vesting period of 4 years. So, as I said, a cliff vest is a lump sum paid out after a defined period of time. So, overall, the vesting schedule tethers you to the company for a total of 4 years. And if the company is acquired, those unvested shares will, in all likelihood, be converted into stock options in the acquiring company. And the reason for that is when people look to acquire a business, more often than not, it's the people who are the real jewels of the assets of the business. So acquiring company doesn't want everybody to be fat, rich, and happy because of the acquisition, but in fact, you want those people to remain with the company post-acquisition in order to accomplish the commercial outcomes that the acquisition was intended to achieve. So, okay, you get past now the idea of you split the founder's pie, you understand the value of options, and now you give some thought to, okay, it's often been said, you hear that a smaller piece of a bigger pie is better than a large piece of a small or non-existent pie. So let's take a look at this. Okay. So this is a case where a company starts, it has a seed round, round 2, round 3, and then a public offering. And the company started with the founder having 100,000 shares and also owning 100% of the company. So taking a look at the seed round, for example, the investors are investing, they're investing $1 million for half the company. So they invest $1 million, they buy half of the company, but that half of the company is after establishing a stock option pool of 20%. So you can see here, founder has 100, stock option pool of 66,000 and change, shares purchased by the investors, 167,000. So the overall share base of the company is 333,333. And what you see is that the percent of the company owned by the founder has decreased from 100% to 30%. And similar mathematics occur moving forward. And so that 30% then drops to 11.25%. So we're certainly talking about a smaller percent, hopefully a larger pie. Round 3, it drops all the way down to 7.3%. And when the IPO occurs, the founder is projected to have 5.81%. So now the question is, so what? What does that mean? Well, down here, we take a look at, okay, transaction occurs, there's a share price involved, In this case, for the seed round, it was $6 a share. So that means on paper, the 100,000 shares owned by the founder is worth that $600,000. And likewise, each time there is a round, there is a change in the share price. In a successful trajectory, you're talking about an increased share price from round to round. And you can see that the value of the founder shares are increasing round by round, even though percent ownership is not. And so when you get out here to the IPO, where that founder may have the opportunity to recognize the financial accomplishments of the company, the founder may only own about 6%, but that's worth almost $11 million. And you have to, as a founder of a company, you need to look at those numbers and say, okay, is that worth my time and effort? If I were to achieve the outcomes that are represented on this forecast, would I be a happy camper if I were to be able to collect $11 million in 5 years, let's say? So that's the issue involved with a smaller piece of a larger pie. Now, when you're looking at growing your business, you will be adding people on a very rifle shot basis, meaning you're going to want to fill a gap in the company's overall leadership that the company needs to be done at a given point in time. So when you look at each of these positions, we're talking about going out and attracting an individual, and under the circumstances, how much equity might that individual deserve upon joining the company. So the case that we're talking about, you've got more often than not, when a company begins a technology spinoff, the inventor may want the role of CEO. That's not unusual, but it will soon become obvious that the CEO, that the inventor really doesn't have the skills to accomplish the CEO's activities, and that CEO that's being recruited under those circumstances is going to be responsible for raising a Series A round of investment or Series B. So a big portion of the responsibilities of the CEO that's recruited in is that person's ability to raise funds for the company. And hopefully that's somebody who has been a CEO and who has done that already and is ready to take on the challenge of this company. And under those circumstances, somebody with that responsibility brought in at, say, 8%, 12%, somewhere in that range. In the case where the technologist is the CEO, it becomes obvious that the CEO really can't run the business. So what we have to do is we have to insert somebody between the CEO and the company and its operations. So you bring in the business guy. This is the person who can direct the activities of the company, the operations. This is typically somebody who comes on board with the title COO, president, and that person, 4 to 8%. Normally, out of all of the C-suite bases, 1 or 2 of those positions are critically important. Vice president of engineering, let's say, or a vice president of business development. So out of the 3, 5, 7 individuals who are reporting up to a CEO or a COO, probably 1 or 2 of those are critical. And those people are typically going to be brought on at 2 to 3.5% of the company. The other people at that role would come in at 1 to 2.5%. And usually a CFO, if it's just a question of doing financial management and reporting, that person is 0.5 to 1% because there are a lot of accountants out there. So, other rules of thumb. When you attract directors to sit on your board, stock options are used to entice them to do so. And for an early stage business, a director may command 0.5 to 1% of the company at that time to come on board. Now, advisors, unlike the directors, don't have any fiduciary responsibilities. Directors do have fiduciary responsibilities. And by that, I mean the board of directors has legal obligations with respect to the rights of the shareholders and must conduct itself in a way that is appropriate. If a company were to crater and there was outstanding payroll, for example, there may be a time where the directors will have to come up with the money to pay that payroll. That's one of the areas where there is that liability. So advisors are not directors. They don't have that risk exposure, and therefore their compensation is going to be less than what a director would get. Founders Fest. So now we go back to the founders pie discussion. And as I mentioned, the founders pie distribution has a component that's related to future performance. And so it is not unusual for, at the time of the first financing, the founders will own 25% of their shares at closing, but the balance of their shares are subject to a buyback provision. So the company, as this progresses, the company can buy back those shares that are still subject to the buyback. And so that buyback reduces at the rate of this vesting. So as of the first anniversary, as of closing, if somebody were to leave the company in 4 months, that person would have 25% and 1/9, so perhaps 36% of their options. So only at the end of 3 years does that individual own all of their stock. And this is often a very challenging discussion with founders, first-time founders, to explain this. But if a founder is unable to perform the job that was intended, and that person has to be separated from the company, then you have to hire somebody to fill that job. And so let's say it's on the first anniversary, the founder owns 50% of his or her shares, and 50% are left for buyback. So the company would, in many cases, buy back those shares, and that would become the pool of stock that would be available for recruiting somebody to perform the job that the founder was not performing. There is a thing called vesting acceleration. And part of that is if you get a company to a liquidity event, it's acquired or it goes public, then some members of management, usually the CEO, if the CEO founder, in some respects, you say, look, I've done my job. My goal was to work with the company to grow it, to get the funding that it required, and position it for an exit. And I've done that. Therefore, I deserve my shares to be vested much more rapidly than the other shares. And what is management friendly would be what's called a double trigger. So let's just use the CEO as a single example. You get to the point where you sell the company in 2 years, and you will have another 24 months before all of your stock would be yours if there weren't some acceleration. So you sell the stock, or you get acquired. Therefore, 1/2 of the unvested shares automatically vest at that closing. And then the balance of those shares will continue to vest on the original schedule. But if the founder were to leave the company under circumstances where the job of supporting the transition had been completed, it might be that that founder may only stick around for 6 months. But having accomplished what they were intending to do with regard to supporting the transition, they were able to get the balance of their shares to accelerate vesting at that time. As I mentioned before, one of the reasons for the stock options and for there not to be acceleration for employees other than those who are at the most senior level is that you want them tethered to the company. An acquirer will take a look at who the people are and are they going to stick and how important are they? And part of the question of will they stick is going to be related to the unvested options that they've got and the incentive that these people will have to stick around to vest those remaining shares. So, supposed to be done in 4 minutes. I think we're going to get there. So with this in mind, when you do financial forecasting for your company, you ought to do a parallel forecasting of distribution of the equity of the company over that time frame. You need help. If you are an entrepreneur doing this for the first time or any time, you worry about these things 2 or 3 times in your life, perhaps. And when these activities are underway, there are a lot of sophisticated issues involved. So you need strong professional assistance. You also need to develop a network of mentors and advisors so that you can act properly for the company and are able to get the advice and the insight you need. This is how you try to level the playing field. And again, accountants and lawyers, while in some cases are a pain in the butt, they are essential in terms of doing deals and having those deals ripple through the company and the outcome. So that is, oh, we had a lot of people join after it got started. So I'm sure Allison has or will distribute that information and a few other things. I'm here if somebody has any questions. And if not, I hope you found this of value and look forward to working with some or all of you in the future.
Thanks, Frank. Do we have any questions from you guys today?
Yeah, I have a question for Frank. So on the slide where you explain the vesting for founders, can you re-explain what you call a double trigger? You said that basically it's management friendly and you could do double trigger, but I didn't really understand what this means.
I wasn't able to understand you. I have some hearing issues. So which of the slides?
So it was the slide where you talk about vesting for founders.
Yeah.
You say that you can do what you call double trigger, which
Yeah.
is like management, friendly. Can you explain exactly what that is? I didn't really understand.
Yeah, that was the situation where the CEO, for example, is when the company is acquired or goes public, the justification is that instead of any unvested shares rolling in past the staying on the original schedule, that person makes the case, or it's an obvious case, that person's job was to drive the company to an exit for the investors as well as the company. And therefore, half of the unvested shares would be vested at the closing of the transaction, and then the balance of those shares would vest automatically at the conclusion of the transition. And both of those events are very likely to happen well within the time frame of the remaining vesting period if that person were to stay there. So we're talking about the people who are building the value that justifies the acquisition, but also the people who are perhaps unlikely to continue with the company post-acquisition. Many CEO founders are iconoclastic individuals, and working as a general manager of a division of a big company does not appeal to them. So in that case, they get the double trigger. They get their compensation for having achieved an exit, and then they get their compensation for supporting the transition, and then they're out of there.
I see. It makes sense. Thank you.
I have a question. So, I mean, I don't know if you could go back to how you had the scenario of various founders, and the scenario you painted was actually developing IP, and you have the person that was doing the research. How about if it was somebody that you wanted to bring on that was in marketing, for example, that might be able to facilitate marketing and distribution, but that's like probably something that's later down the line for that team that you painted. How would something like that work?
Once you've established that a person like that would not be a founder.
Okay, that's good to know.
So you would distribute the founder's pie however you do that, and then the company's up and running. It will have established an option pool, and when that person is being recruited, you will take a look at what such individuals command in terms of ownership in order to join an earlier stage, higher risk company. And like I told you, that might be the person who gets 3% of the company for coming on board at that time.
Thank you so much. That's very helpful.
Sorry, I would like to clarify about the double trigger. Do you mean if the company is acquired by a bigger company, then if double trigger is established, then the founder's options will be given to him, half of it will be given to him immediately, and then what happens to the rest?
Okay. these are typically founder shares, but if there are options, and that's very possible. So at the closing, they get half because they've initiated or created a transaction that has provided liquidity to the investors. And if this is a person who will not be a long-term employee of the acquiring company, that the role that individual will play is one of supporting the transition of the acquisition to the new company. And that may include introducing people to important customers, maintaining relationships with vendors and supporting them. So that person completing the transition so the company on a post-acquisition basis could move ahead without him, that might happen in 6 months, not 24 months. And so if that transition support is deemed as being accomplished, then that individual will get the balance of those shares vesting at that moment in time.
So there's a risk that he will not get all of his shares back, right?
Well, the risk is if he were to leave the company and that transition had not been accomplished, then the second trigger wouldn't come into play, and that individual would only receive the shares that vested from the time of the closing to the time of his separation.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, Frank, I have another question about getting in touch with you. I reached out on LinkedIn. I don't know if that's a good way to be in touch with you. I saw your background. There's a number of things I would want to talk to you about, especially with Innovation Works.
Well, yeah, my email address is probably the best thing.
Okay.
Well, my email address is FD Frank Demmler, and it 0, not capital O, 0, N, Nancy, at andrew.cmu.edu.
So 0, so let me get that again. FD at
FD0 and at andrew.cmu.edu.
0N at andrew.c. Okay. Dot.
FD0N.
Oh, thanks so much. Thanks so much. I see it in the chat. Yes, thanks so much. This has been a very exciting understanding. It's been great. So would love to always keep up with you. This has been a great informative.
This is extraordinarily important, and first-time founders are forced to make very complex decisions with very little past experience with what those decisions are based on. And that's why this presentation is, I won't say this presentation is memorialized, but it really is one of those critical things that a founder needs to do has to prepare for prior to actually creating the company and distributing the founder's pie. And one of the problems I didn't really explain, but if you divide the pie equally and you're going out to raise money from a Series A from an investor, and by that time it's clear that one of the founders is the CEO, has assumed that role, is driving the company forward, and the other people are contributing lesser or nothing, absent what we discussed here, as an investor, I'm going to look at the cap table, and what I want to do is I want to make sure that my management team is properly incented. And when I see a CEO, it has an equal amount of stock as somebody who is not part of the company, but just happened to be there at founding and maybe supporting. I'm going to look at that in two things I know. One is that CEO is really pissed off because he's doing all the heavy lifting. He's the one who's put his career on the line. And these other people are getting benefit from his work without making any contributions. And so if I'm an investor, I take a look at that, and I'm going to, in order for me to make the investment, I'm going to have to do something to reshuffle the deck so that the alignment of the ownership is consistent with what the company actually needs. And what that often will do is there will be a slug of options that are created as part of the pool that are then granted to the founder to make that founder have the proper role relative to the equity hierarchy.
Do we have any other questions for today?
Just one question regarding the founders pie split. So this was a very insightful presentation. Thank you for that. So my question relates to something that's kind of like a conventional wisdom in, at least in startup accelerators like Y Combinator, which kind of promotes having 50% or at least equal shares between all the founders, and their reasoning is that these guys, like, to use their words, are the ones you're going to go to battle with in some sense. So you're going to go through a lot of ups and downs, and everybody, if they have like a equal share, then it kind of incentivizes them. I mean, it basically creates, it kind of like avoids any situation where one might feel, less compensated for or something. So I completely understand what the pointers that you mentioned. I was just wondering what your thoughts are on that kind of reasoning.
Well, Y Combinator has a process that they use to do things. And so to a certain extent, Y Combinator companies have something akin to a cookie cutter. These are the rules. This is how it happens. Now, the people in the Y Combinator, the people who are getting equity, are the ones who have made that full-time commitment. And also in the Y Combinator world, you're talking about companies that are pre-commercialization in most cases. And so that the distribution, or the equal distribution among those founders, number one, is probably more justified than the scenarios that I laid out. And number two, from an administrative point of view, they can't go to the trouble of creating special deals for each of their transactions. They've done hundreds of deals, and unless they have a standard way of doing it, the administrative overhead would be crushing.
I see. All right.
And also to the extent, Y Combinator is sort of putting itself in the role of a founder as well at the time that those decisions are made.
Right. Thank you.
Okay, and if we don't have any other questions, I'm gonna let everybody go, and I'm gonna end the session. Okay, all right. Thanks, guys. Thank you, Frank.
Yeah, awesome.